When her scars became the flag she carried, the first wound she tried to hide, the first scar did not come from a bullet. It was not carved into her skin by steel or shrapnel. It was not even visible to the eye. It began in silence. The silence of a room where a child waited for her father to return, where the smell of bread was mixed with the faint, unfamiliar scent of smoke. That was how she first learned that war does not knock at the door like a guest. It seeps in through the cracks. It enters with the absence of footsteps that once echoed in the hall. It begins when you ask a question and no one answers. Her wound was born before she could name it. Before she understood what war even meant, she carried within her chest the sudden emptiness of safety. That emptiness was her first scar. She was no more than 10 when the war arrived like a shadow thrown across her street. She remembered the day as clearly as the way one remembers the shape of their own hands. The afternoon was soft, the kind of afternoon when the air still smelled of hay and children dared to play outside without fear. She was one of them, skipping rope with her sister. Laughter breaking into the air as if joy itself could not imagine being interrupted. But interruption came, not with a cannon blast, not yet, but with hurried whispers between adults, with doors closing too quickly, with shutters drawn in haste. Her mother called her inside, her voice trembling, though she pretended to be calm. The kitchen, usually a place of warmth and chatter, felt suddenly foreign, as though the walls had learned to listen and repeat secrets. That was the first time she noticed how a room could grow heavier without changing at all. She asked her mother why her father had not returned from the fields. The question fell into the silence like a stone into deep water, swallowed without answer. It was then she realized that silence itself could wound, that not knowing could carve a hollow deeper than pain, and that hollow, invisible to others, became her first scar. In the years to come, she would endure hunger, she would see blood, she would hear explosions that turned night into unnatural daylight. But none of those would surprise her more than the realization that a scar can grow without leaving any mark on the body. It can live in the breath, in the way the heart beats faster when footsteps echo too close, in the way a child stops asking questions because answers have become too dangerous. This scar was not hers alone. She would later see it in the eyes of other women, women who carried pots of boiling water to feed 10 mouths with 1 potato, women who wrapped their children in wool blankets torn from their own coats, women who smiled with their lips while their eyes remained elsewhere, fixed on some distant memory of before. Her first scar was not about loss, it was about waiting. Waiting for the return of what would never come, waiting for the sound of familiar footsteps, waiting for someone to say, "It is over now." But wars do not end that way. They end in echoes, in fragments, in half-forgotten promises. And so she hid the scar, as children do, behind forced laughter, behind daydreams that painted the world brighter than it was. She became skilled at pretending, at carrying silence as if it were only a shadow and not a wound. Years later, when she was older and the war had left marks far deeper than she could count, she would look back and realize the first scar had already been enough to change her, enough to teach her that survival does not begin on the battlefield. It begins in the kitchen, in the unanswered questions, in the soft spaces of daily life where war intrudes like an uninvited guest. But at 10, she did not yet know this. She only knew that the bread on the table no longer tasted the same, that her mother's hands shook when kneading dough. That laughter carried a crack in it she had never heard before. She wanted to ask, if safety can disappear overnight, then what is real? If silence can wound, what else can harm me without touching me? But she swallowed the questions. Her silence, too, became part of the scar. The kitchen that smelled of bread and gunpowder. The kitchen had always been the center of her childhood. It was the place where mornings began, with the soft sound of bread crusts cracking in the oven, where afternoons ended with steam rising from bowls of soup, too thin to fill every stomach, yet seasoned with the comfort of her mother's presence. But when the war entered their village, the kitchen changed. It became a battlefield in its own way, though no soldier stepped across its threshold, though no bombs directly fell upon it. The war was present in the ration cards, stacked neatly beside the flour jar, in the way her mother cut bread into thinner slices, her knife trembling as if each movement carried the weight of sacrifice. The kitchen smelled of bread, yes, but also of fear. And beneath the faint warmth of the oven lingered the metallic, acrid scent of gunpowder drifting in from the outside streets. She would never forget the moment those two scents first mingled, bread and gunpowder. It was a smell that defined her adolescence. To others, war was the sound of artillery. For her, it was the smell of survival mixed with destruction. The oven's glow beside the memory of fire in the distance. She learned then that women at war were keepers of impossible contradictions. They had to stretch flour until it felt like a miracle. They had to stir soup while listening for footsteps of men who might break through the door. They had to sing lullabies to children with voices that carried steadiness they did not feel inside. Her mother's hands bore witness to this contradiction. Cracked from cold water, red from scrubbing, trembling from hunger, they moved with determination, as though the act of cooking itself was resistance. Every loaf of bread pulled from the oven was not just food, it was defiance. It was the statement, "We are still alive. We will not starve quietly." The girl watched closely, her young eyes memorizing every gesture. She understood that these daily rituals, grinding, kneading, slicing, were as important as any battle fought outside, perhaps even more, because battles could win or lose territories, but kitchens won or lost souls. Sometimes soldiers knocked at the door. They came not to fight, but to take. Bread, wine, sometimes even the last potato from the basket. And always her mother gave with trembling hands but steady eyes. She gave because refusal meant punishment, yet she always left a scrap hidden for her children. The girl once asked, "Why do you always keep something back?" Her mother replied softly, "Because if you give them everything, they take even your will, and that I will not surrender." It was then she realized survival was not just about food. It was about refusing to let despair eat everything inside you. Nights were the hardest. The kitchen glowed faintly from a single candle, the wax dripping slowly like time itself dissolving. Outside, distant blasts shook the earth, and the smell of smoke seeped through the cracks of the wooden door. She would lie awake, hearing her mother whisper prayers while preparing tomorrow's bread. She sometimes wondered, does she pray for the war to end or simply for the dough to rise? In that space of bread and gunpowder, she grew older. She learned to measure not only flour, but also fear. She discovered that silence carried flavor too, the taste of waiting, the bitterness of hunger. And yet, she also learned something else. She learned that resilience can live in the smallest of gestures, in the way her mother folded a napkin with care, even when meals were scarce, in the way she hummed an old song while peeling potatoes, in the way she looked at her children with tired eyes that still managed to shine with love. Years later, she would tell herself that this was the true front line for women, the kitchen table. Not the maps spread by generals, not the speeches given on podiums, but the fragile circle where family gathered in the midst of chaos. It was in that circle she learned her second scar, not an open wound this time, but the scar of hunger that gnawed without blood, the scar of sacrifice that tasted of burnt crusts and thin soups. She carried it silently, yet it shaped her as much as the louder violence outside. The kitchen that once smelled only of bread now carried memories of both loss and survival. Bread and gunpowder, life and death, hope and despair, And in that contradiction she began to understand that her scars were not only personal, but collective. They were the flag she and her mother silently carried, even before she realized it. Because every loaf baked under fear was a declaration: we are still here, we remain human. And sometimes, in the dark silence of night, that was enough to keep the world from collapsing entirely. Letters that never reached their destination. The first time she held a letter in her hands, it felt like touching hope itself. Paper was fragile, thinner than the fabric of her dress, yet somehow it carried entire worlds within it. Ink lines became bridges across distance, across silence, across fear. For a girl whose life had been reduced to waiting and surviving, letters promised something more, the possibility of connection. But war has its own way of treating words. It steals them, it delays them, it silences them before they ever arrive. Many of the letters she wrote she never sent. Many of the letters she sent never arrived. And many of the letters that arrived were opened by hands that were not hers, read by eyes that judged, censored, erased. Yet she kept writing. Because sometimes survival is not only about bread and water, sometimes it is about keeping words alive, even if no one reads them. She began writing to her father, the one who had left for the front and never returned. She wrote of small things, how the apple tree behind the house had finally borne fruit, how her little brother had learned to whistle, how mother's hair seemed to have turned grayer in only a season. She wrote as if her words could hold him near, as if by describing the life he left behind, she could stitch a thread strong enough to pull him back home. But the letters piled up unsent, tied with a ribbon and hidden in a wooden drawer. She never knew if he would ever read them. Perhaps he was already gone. Perhaps he was alive, but too far. Perhaps the paper itself would someday turn to dust before it ever reached him. Later she wrote to friends who had fled, to neighbors taken away, to cousins she had not seen in years. The act of writing became a ritual. Each night by candlelight, the scratch of the pen against paper echoing like a heartbeat in the silence of the kitchen. She poured herself into those words, her fear, her hunger, her hopes. She asked questions she never dared to speak aloud. Do you still remember me? Do you still dream at night? Do you still believe the world will heal? She signed her letters with love, with longing, with fragments of herself. And then she folded them neatly, sealed them, and waited. But waiting in war is not like waiting in peace. It is not a matter of patience. It is a matter of endurance. Most of the time, nothing arrived in return. The rare letters that did reach her were often stained by rain, by mud, sometimes even by blood. She held them with trembling fingers, inhaling the smell of ink and earth, as if by breathing deeply she could catch the scent of the one who had written them. One letter, from a friend who had escaped to another country, said simply, "I am alive, but I am not the same." Another, from a cousin at the front, had been censored so heavily that entire lines were blacked out, leaving only fragments of sentences. "The nights are long. The cold is cruel. I dream of bread." She cried over that one, not only because of what was said, but because of all the things erased. Letters became both her salvation and her torment. Each one was proof of life, but also proof of distance. Each one carried love, but also reminded her of loss. The worst were the letters that never came back. She would wait weeks, months, clinging to the hope that perhaps tomorrow the postman would arrive. Perhaps tomorrow a scrap of paper would bring news, would bring a voice across the silence. But tomorrow often came empty-handed, and so another scar grew. The scar of unanswered words. The scar of paper that carried only her side of the story. "Still," she wrote, because to stop writing would mean surrendering to silence. And silence, she knew, was heavier than hunger. Her letters became prayers, folded and sealed. She began to write not just to people but to the war itself, as if she could bargain with it. If you must take, take me last. If you must burn, spare the children. If you must stay, let me at least carry words until the end. Years later, when the war was finally over, she still kept the bundle of unsent letters. They were yellowed, fragile, the ink faded, but they were her testimony, her proof that even when bombs fell, even when soldiers marched, she still believed in the power of words. The letters that never reached their destination became part of her identity. They were her invisible monument, her quiet anthem. They whispered to her that though much had been destroyed, she had never stopped trying to connect, to love, to remember. And so, another flag stitched itself into her being, not of fabric, not of symbols, but of words that refused to vanish. Her scars deepened, but so did her strength, because sometimes what is never delivered still survives. The night she learned the weight of silence. The night did not come suddenly. It crept in, slow and deliberate, like a shadow deciding where to settle. She remembered it not for the absence of light, but for the absence of sound. There had been nights filled with noise, nights where the sky cracked open with thunder that was not thunder, where the ground trembled as if the earth itself had joined the war. Those nights were terrible, but they were expected. What no one taught her to fear was the silence, the kind that arrives so heavy it presses against your chest until you wonder if you are breathing at all. That night, silence was the invader. She had been sitting beside her younger brother, both of them huddled on the floor with their backs against the kitchen wall. Their mother moved quietly from window to window, making sure every crack was covered, as though fabric could keep danger out. The girl wanted to ask something, but her mother put a finger to her lips before the words escaped. That single gesture carried 1,000 warnings. It told her that questions could be fatal, that even whispers had weight, that silence was not absence, but survival. The candle on the table flickered, struggling against the darkness. Its flame was so small, yet it felt like the only voice left in the room. She stared at it, wondering if it too was afraid of being noticed. Outside, there were no footsteps, no shouts, no blasts, only stillness. It was a stillness so absolute that even the smallest creak of wood sounded like betrayal. She held her breath every time the wind touched the house, terrified that the house itself might give them away. Her brother's hand slipped into hers. His fingers were tiny, warm, trembling. She squeezed them gently, trying to anchor him, though she herself felt like a boat without sails, drifting on waters she could not see. He looked at her with wide eyes, searching for answers she did not have. She wished she could tell him it would be fine, but she had already learned that promises were fragile, and in war they shattered too easily. So she gave him the only gift she could, her silence, steady, unbroken, like a shield she didn't know she could carry. That night she understood something that would follow her forever. Silence is not empty. It is full, full of what you cannot say, full of the screams you swallow, full of the prayers you dare not speak aloud. Silence holds weight, and when you carry it long enough, it leaves scars as deep as any wound. She realized that silence was not just a pause between words, it was a language of fear, of endurance, of survival. She wondered then, as the candle flickered lower, if silence could kill. If not by bullet or blade, then by slow suffocation. Because silence meant you could not cry out when your heart broke, you could not call for help when despair knocked, you could not scream when injustice tore your world apart. Silence demanded obedience. It demanded the erasure of self. And yet, paradoxically, silence also protected. It shielded them from the ears outside, from the boots that might march too close. It kept them alive. It both suffocated and saved. Her mother finally sat down beside them, her hands folded tightly in her lap. The girl watched her in the half-light, noticing how her shoulders shook, though her face remained composed. That was the night she realized strength did not always look like courage. Sometimes strength looked like quiet trembling held under control, like words unsaid, because saying them might cost everything. She thought then, if silence can wound, can it also heal? If it can suffocate, can it also protect? Could silence be both enemy and ally at once? The hours stretched endlessly, measured only by the melting of wax and the rhythm of their own breathing. She could not sleep. She felt as if the silence itself would not allow her to close her eyes, as though to surrender to sleep would mean letting go of the fragile thread that held them in safety. At one point she thought she heard distant boots, faint, muffled, then gone. Or maybe it was only her imagination shaped by fear into footsteps. That uncertainty was its own torture. The silence gave no answers. When morning finally arrived, it came without fanfare. The candle had died, the room smelled faintly of smoke and sweat, and her mother's eyes were ringed with shadows. Nothing had happened, the house still stood. No soldiers had entered. And yet, the girl felt as though she had lived through a battle. Not one fought with weapons, but one fought against the crushing weight of soundless hours. It was then she realized, sometimes surviving a night of silence is harder than surviving a night of explosions. Because noise, at least, tells you what is happening. Silence forces you to imagine, and imagination can be far more cruel. Years later, whenever people spoke of the war, they mentioned battles, dates, strategies, victories, losses. Few spoke of the silence. Few remembered how silence itself had been a weapon, one that pressed against the hearts of those left waiting, those hidden in kitchens and basements, those who could not move or speak for fear of being heard. But she remembered. She remembered how heavy silence was, how it carved itself into her bones. That night became a part of her, a scar invisible to others but undeniable within her. And when she grew older, when scars multiplied, she realized that night had prepared her for a truth she carried always. Sometimes the world breaks not with sound, but with silence, and if you survive it, you carry that silence forever, like a flag folded inside your chest. Her skin was a map of invisible battles. Her body did not look like the stories of war. There were no medals pinned to her chest, no uniforms carrying the scent of smoke, no photographs of her standing beside crumbling ruins. To strangers, she seemed ordinary, almost untouched, just another woman who lived through difficult years. But she knew in the quiet of her own reflection that her skin carried more than what eyes could see. It carried battles that never made it into history books. Struggles fought in kitchens, in cold nights, in endless lines for bread, in the private terrain of her own endurance. She had scars, yes, but not the kind people expected. There was the small white line across her wrist where she had once cut herself while slicing turnips in the dim candlelight, her hand shaking with hunger. There was the roughness of her palms, permanently marked by scrubbing, washing, carrying water long after her muscles had begged her to stop. But deeper than these physical traces were the invisible marks, the way her body tensed at sudden noises, the way her breath caught when footsteps echoed behind her, the way she learned to smile even when her stomach growled. Each scar was a map of a battle unseen. There was the battle of hunger, where she rationed her portion so her younger brother could eat more. The battle of sleep, where she lay awake for hours listening for danger, her mind unable to rest even when her eyes ached. The battle of silence, where she swallowed her questions, her screams, her dreams. The battle of waiting, where each day stretched endlessly, a reminder that time itself could be crueler than any enemy. No medals were given for these victories. No songs were sung, yet she knew they mattered, because without them, survival itself would have crumbled. She sometimes touched her own arm in the dark, tracing her skin as if trying to read the invisible writing carved there. She thought, if my body could speak, what would it say? Would it tell of the nights I hid my fear so others would not fall apart? Would it tell of the times I stitched torn clothes with numb fingers while outside the world collapsed? Would it tell of the ache in my chest that never healed? The ache of absence, of longing, of words unsaid. Her body was not a monument, but it carried memory, memory in the way her steps slowed near ruins, memory in the way her hands shook when folding letters, memory in the way her shoulders bent slightly forward, as if forever bracing against a storm that might return at any moment. She often wondered if others could see it. Could they sense the map she carried on her skin, or was it invisible to everyone but her? Sometimes she noticed other women, their eyes tired yet strong, their laughter breaking too quickly into silence. She recognized in them the same invisible cartography, the same geography of pain and endurance. They too carried battles that no one celebrated. They too bore scars written in silence. Years later, when peace returned in name but not in feeling, people would ask her about the war. They wanted stories of soldiers, of battles, of flags raised in triumph. She never knew what to say. How could she explain that her war was not fought with rifles, but with spoons and thread, with silence and patience, with resilience hidden in the daily act of surviving? How could she make them understand that the battlefield was her own body, her own mind, her own skin, and that every day she had to fight to keep her humanity alive? She thought sometimes of drawing it out, of creating a map that showed her invisible wounds. Here, the place where hunger gnawed. Here, the night when silence crushed. Here, the day when hope nearly left her. But there was no paper large enough, no ink dark enough to capture what it meant. So she carried the map inside her, her skin the parchment, her scars the ink. And though the world often forgot women like her, she knew the truth. Without these invisible battles, without the scars they left behind, there would be no story of survival at all. She was not a hero in the eyes of history, but in the secret, sacred language of scars, she was a flag raised quietly against despair. Her skin was not flawless, it was not smooth, it was not untouched. But it was alive, and in the end, that was victory enough, where women wove flags out of ashes. There are moments in history that never make it into official records because they do not look like victories. They do not come with trumpets or speeches or the planting of banners on ruined fortresses. They come in kitchens and basements, in shelters and fields, in the quiet corners where women gathered to do what no general ever considered important, but what survival itself demanded. It was in those places that she saw women weaving flags out of ashes, not in the literal sense of fabric and thread, but in the way they took what had been broken and made something whole enough to hold hope. She remembered sitting among them, her fingers raw from work, her back aching from long hours of bending. They were not soldiers, not politicians, not leaders in any formal sense. They were daughters and mothers, sisters and widows, ordinary women who had been told their place was small, that their voices were quiet, that their role was only to wait. Yet here they were, carrying more than silence, carrying the memory of everything that was falling apart. The room was dim, the air heavy with smoke that drifted in from the bombed streets outside. Yet their hands moved with steady purpose. Some mended torn clothing, others stitched together blankets from scraps. And some even took old flags that had been trampled and dirtied and washed them carefully, as though to remind themselves that identity could survive even when nations were reduced to rubble. She herself took pieces of cloth too small to cover a child and sewed them into something larger, not because the end result was strong, but because it meant she was refusing to let fragments remain, only fragments. It struck her that this was what women had always done: gather the broken, gather the discarded, gather what was deemed useless, and turn it into a fabric strong enough to hold a family, a memory, a people. War tried to divide, to tear, to reduce everything to ash. But women quietly, insistently turned ash into something that could still be carried forward. She thought of her mother's hands again, kneading bread with too little flour. She thought of her grandmother, who had told stories by the fire in times before the war, weaving tales out of fear and turning them into lessons of endurance. And she thought of herself, a girl who had once been too afraid to breathe in silence, now sitting among women and stitching scraps of fabric together, realizing that this act too was a form of defiance. There were nights when bombs reduced entire streets to nothing but smoke and rubble. In the mornings that followed, she and the others would search through the debris, not only for food or wood, but for fabric, a corner of a curtain, a piece of clothing, even a thread from something burned. These were treasures. They were not cloth anymore, but symbols. Symbols that something could still be saved, something could still be made, even when the world insisted it was finished. One of the women, an older widow named Marta, used to hum while she worked. Her voice was low, cracked but steady, and she sang songs older than the war itself. No one asked her to stop, though her humming sometimes carried sadness so deep it ached in the chest. They let her sing because her voice reminded them that life had existed before the war and would continue after. Marta used to say, "Every stitch we make is a refusal. Every blanket we sew is a prayer. Every scrap we hold is proof that nothing is ever completely gone." Those words stayed with her. She carried them like talismans, repeating them silently when despair threatened to drown her. Every stitch is a refusal. Every act of mending is rebellion. Every fragment saved is a flag raised against destruction. The irony was not lost on her that the generals outside, the men with weapons and power, believed themselves to be carrying the future of the nation. Yet it was in these dim rooms, with women bent over cloth and ash, that the true future was being stitched. Nations fall if people give up. Nations survive when someone still believes that broken pieces can be gathered. And women, who had always been tasked with gathering, became the invisible seamstresses of survival. She recalled one particular night when everything seemed lost. Their town had been bombed relentlessly, the air filled with ash so thick it felt like snow falling from the heavens, except this snow burned your throat when you breathed it in. People wandered through the ruins in silence, unable to cry, unable to scream. And yet, in a small corner of what remained of the church basement, she and the other women gathered. They did not talk about the destruction outside. They simply worked, their hands moving as though guided by something greater than themselves. She remembered taking a piece of burned fabric, its edges blackened, and holding it to her chest. It smelled of smoke, of endings, but as she sewed it into a larger piece, it became something else. It became part of a new fabric, a new whole. The transformation was small, perhaps invisible to anyone else, but to her it felt like resurrection. She whispered to herself, "Even ashes can be woven into flags." Her younger brother once asked her why she spent so many nights stitching instead of sleeping. She kissed his forehead and told him, "Because if we stop mending, we stop believing. And if we stop believing, then the war has already won." He didn't fully understand then, but he smiled, as children do when they sense truth in a voice, even without grasping the words. Years later, when peace returned, people displayed clean new flags in the streets, waving them in celebration. She smiled at them, but in her heart, she carried a different flag, the one woven in dim rooms, out of ashes and scraps, out of silence and persistence. That invisible flag, unseen by crowds, was the one she had truly carried. It was made of scars and patience, of women's hands and whispered songs. It was not raised on a pole, but carried quietly in the hearts of those who refused to surrender to despair. And she knew that if anyone ever asked her what she remembered most from those years, she would not speak of soldiers or battles or speeches. She would speak of the women who wove flags out of ashes, the ones who showed her that resilience is not loud. It is quiet, steady, and stitched together from what remains when everything else has burned. For it was in those nights, in the dim light of candles and the smell of smoke, that she learned the truest secret of survival, that even in ruins, even in silence, even in ash, women will find a way to weave life again. Children she raised beside the ruins. She often wondered how children could grow in a place where almost nothing else did. The war had left the ground torn open, had turned gardens into wastelands and schools into rubble, had scattered families like ashes across the wind. Yet children remained, fragile yet stubborn, their voices piercing the silence, their laughter flickering like sparks in the dark. She carried them as one carries fragile glass, terrified that the world would shatter them, but amazed at how often they seemed to glow even brighter than she did. Her brother was the first she learned to raise beside ruins. He was younger by several years, a boy whose earliest memories were already shaped by the sound of distant cannons and the hunger that tightened stomachs into knots. He had no memory of what life had been like before the war, and sometimes she envied him for that. At least he carried no comparison, no constant ache of before. But she also pitied him because his childhood was not filled with games in open fields, but with hiding, waiting, and making toys out of broken wood, pulled from destroyed houses. She became both sister and mother to him, watching over him with an intensity that often left her exhausted. Her mother, though still present, was too weighed down by the endless tasks of survival. Cooking, bartering, mending, burying hope quietly in her chest. So it fell on her, still only half a child herself, to protect him from the world outside. She shielded him with stories, whispering tales of castles and heroes at night, so that the blasts outside would become, if only for a moment, dragons instead of bombs. She gave him pieces of bread before she ate herself, convincing him she wasn't hungry when her stomach burned with emptiness. It was in those moments she realized that raising a child in war was not about teaching them how to live. It was about teaching them how not to stop believing. Belief became their daily bread. Belief that tomorrow would come. Belief that laughter was still allowed. Belief that broken toys could still bring joy. That small victories, a bird's nest surviving in a tree, a flower daring to bloom among the rubble, were worth celebrating. There were other children too, neighbors' children whose parents had vanished, cousins who had lost homes, even orphans left wandering after a raid. She took them in when she could, sometimes only for a night, sometimes for weeks, their faces smudged with dirt, their eyes wide with shock. She taught them small things, how to fold paper into boats, how to hum softly when the silence became too heavy, how to hold each other's hands when fear grew too large. These lessons were not in any book, but they were the foundation of survival. The ruins around them became their playground. Broken walls were castles, burnt-out cars became fortresses, streets filled with rubble turned into mazes of imagination. She marveled at their ability to transform devastation into games. Yet even as they laughed, she saw the shadows in their eyes. The way their play was interrupted too quickly by the sound of a distant explosion, the way they froze when footsteps approached. Childhood itself was fractured, split between innocence and terror. Sometimes she asked herself, what does it mean to raise children in a world that no longer protects them? What does it mean to teach them hope when every day threatens to prove it false? What kind of mother, sister, guardian can I be when I have no certainty myself? And yet she continued, because not to continue would have meant surrender, and surrender was not something she could offer them. One night, as the children slept huddled together under patched blankets, she sat awake and watched their faces. In the dim glow of the candle, she saw how peaceful they looked, as though war did not exist, as though the world outside was not crumbling. She realized then that children carry an extraordinary gift, the ability to dream even in ruins. Their sleep was not haunted the way hers was. Their dreams still carried fields and skies, laughter and freedom. That realization steadied her. If they could dream, then she could keep going. Raising them beside ruins also meant teaching them about loss. Death was not hidden from them. It was a neighbor, always near. She learned to answer their questions gently. Why did she not wake up? Why did they not return? Why is that house gone? She never lied, but she always added, we still have today, we still have each other, we still have enough to try again tomorrow. These were truths she wasn't always sure of, but they were truths she needed to give. There were moments of joy too, small, fleeting yet eternal in memory. The time her brother found a stray kitten and insisted on feeding it crumbs. The day the children discovered a piano in a ruined house, its keys out of tune but still capable of making music, and they sang as though the world was not falling apart. The afternoon when rain poured so heavily that the rubble turned into rivers, and they splashed in it, laughing, their shoes soaked, their worries washed away for a brief hour. These moments were fragile, but they became sacred. They were proof that life was still stronger than destruction. Years later, when peace was finally declared, she thought back to those days and realized that what she had done was more than survival. She had raised resilience. The children she guarded carried scars, yes, but they also carried a strange kind of strength. They knew the value of small joys, the power of laughter, the necessity of holding on to one another. They had learned that even in ruins, love can grow. Her brother, grown now, once told her, "You gave me childhood even when there was none left." She cried when he said that, because she had always feared she had failed him, feared that the ruins had swallowed too much. But he insisted, and she knew then that every story whispered, every crumb shared, every hand held in the dark, had mattered. The ruins never left them. They were part of their memory, part of their skin, part of the flag she carried silently. But alongside the ruins were the children's voices, the echoes of their laughter, the strength of their dreams. That was the balance she carried. The destruction of war and the resilience of children woven together in a fabric that could never be torn apart completely. In the end, she realized that to raise children beside ruins was not only about keeping them alive. It was about planting seeds of hope in ground that seemed barren, about teaching them that even in brokenness there is possibility. Her scars deepened, yes, but they became the soil from which resilience grew, and when she looked at the children she had raised, she saw that they were not just survivors. They were proof that life, stubborn and fragile, always insists on blooming again. And so, when people asked her how she endured, she did not speak of her own strength. She spoke of the children who laughed beside ruins, who dreamed in the shadow of war, who carried forward the songs and stories she gave them. They were her flag, her proof, her living testimony. And though the world had tried to bury them under rubble, they had risen, as children always do, reaching for light even in the darkest of nights. The songs that survived the trenches. Long before she ever understood the meaning of war, she had understood the meaning of song. Her earliest memories were filled with melodies, her mother humming as she kneaded bread, her grandmother whispering lullabies as she tucked her underblankets, neighbors singing softly at harvest time. Songs had always been the invisible threads binding life together, weaving joy into sorrow, weaving memory into silence. When the war came, it tried to steal everything: food, safety, time, even laughter. But the one thing it could never silence completely was song. She remembered the first time she heard it rise above the destruction. It was deep into winter, the cold having seeped into their bones, the nights long and cruel. People gathered in the cellar not only for safety, but for warmth, huddling close, their breath visible in the flickering candlelight. Hunger gnawed at them, silence pressed heavy, and despair was thick in the air. Then, almost without warning, someone began to hum, At first it was barely a note, almost lost in the draught that blew through the broken stones, but it lingered, stubborn, refusing to be swallowed by the cold. One by one, others joined. A harmony built, trembling yet steady, rising from lips cracked by hunger, from throats dry with fear. She did not know who started it. Perhaps no one knew. But suddenly, the cellar was full of something larger than fear. It was full of song. She felt it vibrate inside her chest, stronger than her heartbeat, lifting her for a moment above the ruins that surrounded them. From that night on, she began to notice how songs survived, even in the darkest places. Soldiers carried them into trenches, mothers whispered them into their babies' ears, children chanted them while playing among rubble. Songs became the secret language of resilience. They carried hope without needing words. They reminded people of a life before war and insisted there could be life after it. She herself clung to a handful of melodies. There was the lullaby her mother had sung, one that spoke of stars guiding travelers home. She sang it to her younger brother when bombs rattled the windows, her voice trembling but steady enough to soothe him into sleep. There was the harvest song her grandmother once sang, even when there was no harvest left, its rhythm reminding her of cycles, of the certainty that seasons would return. And there were songs created during the war itself, songs whispered in secret, forbidden songs that mocked those in power, that reminded people they were not alone. She discovered that songs did not need instruments. The human voice itself was enough. In the absence of violins and pianos, they clapped hands, tapped feet, created rhythm with spoons against pots. She remembered one evening when a group of women, exhausted after hours of stitching clothes and gathering scraps, began to sing together. Their voices filled the small room until it felt larger than the war itself, larger than fear, larger than hunger. She thought then, this is our true anthem, not the one shouted by leaders, but the one born in tired throats, the one stitched into our breaths. What amazed her most was how songs could cross boundaries the war tried to enforce. She once heard, faintly across a battlefield, the echo of a tune that sounded almost like their own, sung by voices that were supposed to be enemies. In that moment, she realized music belonged to no side. It belonged to humanity itself. Even soldiers, trapped in mud and blood, needed something to remind them they were human, that beyond orders and uniforms, they still carried beating hearts. There were moments when she feared she would forget herself, that the silence of war would erase who she was, that hunger would strip her of identity. But when she sang, even quietly, even to herself, she remembered. Songs were not just melodies, they were anchors. They tied her to her past, to her people, to her own strength. They were scars turned into sound, wounds transformed into rhythm. Once she was asked by a child, "Why do you always sing at night?" She smiled and answered, "Because if the night only hears silence, it grows too heavy. But if it hears even one voice, the night remembers that it will not last forever." The child nodded, not fully understanding, but years later that child would carry the same songs forward, proof that music outlives fear. Her mother once told her, "A dry eye may look strong, but a wet one can water hope." She did not understand then, but in time she saw how true it was. Tears watered seeds of empathy. They softened hearts hardened by fear. They reminded everyone that humanity had not been erased. In a world where leaders demanded stone faces and iron wills, her tears became quiet rebellion. They said, "I will not become stone. I will not become silence. I will remain human." There were nights when she cried so much that she thought she might drown in herself. But in the morning, she noticed something extraordinary. Her tears did not weaken her. They emptied her just enough to carry on. They carved channels inside her soul, rivers that made space for resilience to flow. And when others needed it, they crossed those rivers. They drank from them. They allowed themselves to be held by the fact that she could weep openly. She remembered a woman named Sophia, whose husband had been taken, leaving her with 3 children and no food. One night, Sophia broke down in front of her, collapsing into sobs so raw they seemed torn from the earth itself. Without thinking, she began to cry too, her tears mixing with Sophia's until they could no longer tell whose was whose. In that moment, strength did not come from silence. It came from shared grief, from the river flowing between them, carrying both their losses at once. She began to see her tears as a kind of language, one more honest than words. When her voice failed, her tears spoke. When her hands trembled, her tears steadied others. People trusted her not because she never cried, but because she did. Her tears became the proof that it was possible to endure without erasing oneself. Years later, when she told her story, she often said, "I carried many scars, but none as precious as the rivers my tears created. They carved paths not just for me, but for those who walked beside me." It was true. Her tears had carried mothers who had lost sons, children who had lost parents, neighbors who had lost homes. They flowed quietly, invisibly, yet they held others afloat when despair threatened to pull them under. In war, rivers are rare. Bridges collapse, roads crumble, connections are severed. Yet her tears became bridges of their own. They allowed others to cross from despair to comfort, from isolation to togetherness, from silence to expression. No general could command them, no bomb could destroy them, no silence could erase them. They were hers, freely given, endlessly flowing. She came to believe that tears are sacred because they blur the line between one person and another. When she wept with someone, their pain became hers and hers became theirs. They merged into one, carrying each other across. That merging was survival itself. For survival is not only about food or shelter, it is about refusing to be alone in suffering. And so her tears, once hidden, became a flag in their own right. A flag not raised high above ruins, but flowing quietly among them. A flag that reminded others, we are still human, even here, even now. When the war ended, when speeches filled the air with triumphant words, she did not feel triumph. She felt the rivers still inside her, still flowing, still connecting. The world tried to tell her to stop crying, to smile, to rebuild, to be silent again. But she knew her tears had saved her, had saved others. She refused to be ashamed of them. They had been rivers others crossed. And because of that, life had gone on. The day the generals forgot her name. History books are always heavy with names. Names of kings and ministers, names of generals and soldiers, names of treaties and battles. But her name, like the names of so many women who survived wars without weapons, was never written. That erasure was its own wound, one that came not with blood but with silence. And yet, she felt its weight as surely as she had ever felt hunger or grief. She remembered the day victory was declared. Bells rang, voices filled the streets, flags waved in the air. Generals rode through the city with medals pinned to their chests, their faces lifted high to meet the cheers of the crowd. Photographers captured their smiles, their salutes, their triumph. People called them heroes. But as she stood among the crowd, clutching her brother's hand, she thought of the kitchens where women had kept families alive, the cellars where mothers had hushed crying babies while bombs shook the walls, the sewing rooms where scraps of ash-stained cloth had been stitched into blankets. None of those stories were told. None of those names were spoken. She did not envy the generals their applause. What she envied was recognition. She wanted the world to know that survival had not been won by speeches alone, that war had been endured not only in trenches but in homes, that her scars were as much part of victory as their medals. Yet when she looked around, she realized the truth. The generals had already forgotten her name. They had never known it to begin with. It was not only her. It was Marta, who had hummed old songs while stitching cloth. It was Sophia, who had raised 3 children alone after her husband was taken. It was her mother, who had kept bread on the table when there was almost no flour left. None of their names would be written. None of their faces would be carved into stone monuments. Their survival was quiet, and history does not record quiet. At first, the absence of recognition burned. She felt bitterness rise like smoke in her chest. She wanted to scream, "Do you not see us? Do you not understand what we carried? Do you not know that your triumph rests on the backs of those who endured without weapons?" But she did not scream. She simply held her silence because silence was what had always been asked of her. And then she began to understand something deeper. Perhaps forgetting by generals was inevitable, but forgetting by the women themselves was not. So she remembered. She told stories to her brother, to the children who grew up beside ruins, to anyone who would listen. She spoke of the night silence pressed too heavy, of the letters that never arrived, of the songs sung in cellars, of the flags woven from ashes. She spoke their names, Marta, Sophia, her mother, again and again, weaving them into memory like threads in a fabric. If history would not write them, then memory would. If generals forgot, then daughters would remember. She began to see her scars differently. Once, they had felt like shame, marks to be hidden, proof of weakness. Now she saw them as names themselves, etched invisibly into her skin. Each scar carried a story, and every story carried someone who would otherwise vanish. When she traced her own scars in the dark, she whispered the names of the women she had known, binding them to herself so they would never be lost. The day the generals forgot her name was also the day she realized that names do not need monuments to survive. They survive in stories, in lullabies, in the quiet resilience passed from one generation to the next. She carried her name and the names of countless others, not in books or speeches, but in the way she lived, in the lessons she taught, in the scars she refused to hide. Years later, when she was asked by her grandchildren what she remembered most of the war, she did not speak of generals. She did not speak of battles or treaties or flags raised on rubble. She said, "I remember women. Women who held the world together when it was falling apart. Women who carried scars like banners. Women who the world forgot, but I never will." And as she said it, she touched the lines of her hands, the worn surface of her skin, as if her body itself were the archive that history refused to keep. She no longer waited for recognition. She no longer longed for her name to be spoken by those who had never seen her labor. Instead, she chose to become her own witness, to carry memory like fire, to protect it from silence, to ensure that when the world turned its gaze elsewhere, she remained the keeper of truth. The day the generals forgot her name, she carried on as she always had, quietly, steadily, with resilience that no applause could measure. And in that persistence, she found a deeper kind of immortality. For history may write the names of generals, but memory, real, living memory, belongs to those who refuse to let silence erase them. And so her scars became her monument, her voice became her record, her survival became her recognition. Though forgotten by generals, she was remembered by those who crossed her rivers of tears. who heard her songs in the night, who ate the bread she stretched into miracles. They remembered, and that was enough, because the truth is simple. Generals may forget, but children raised beside ruins, mothers who shared hunger, neighbors who wept together, they never forget. And in their memory, her name lived, quietly, invisibly, eternally, the scar that refused to fade. Some wounds closed quickly, leaving behind almost nothing. A scratch healed within days, a cut sealed itself after weeks. Even some memories, though sharp when first felt, softened with time until they seemed distant, almost unreal. But there was one scar she carried that never faded. It was not written on her skin where anyone could see it. It was buried deeper, carved into her memory, into her breath, into her very way of moving through the world. No salve healed it, no passing year erased it. The scar had no precise beginning. It was not the moment her father failed to return, though that absence had carved silence into her life. It was not the nights spent in cellars, though those had pressed fear into her bones. It was not hunger, though that had taught her body to live with less. The scar was all of it together. It was the sum of everything endured, compressed into a single ache that refused to dissolve. She first noticed its permanence when peace was declared. Others celebrated, waving flags, dancing in the streets, embracing as though the war had ended not only in reality, but also in spirit. Yet when she stood among them, she felt something different. Relief, yes, but also weight. She carried the war inside her still, as if it had taken residence in her chest. She smiled when others smiled, but her heart was not light. Her heart still remembered every silence, every hunger, every absence. That was when she realized some scars do not fade because they are not meant to. The scar revealed itself in small ways. When footsteps echoed behind her, her body tensed before her mind could remind her she was safe. When thunder rolled across the sky, she flinched, hearing bombs instead. When she smelled bread baking, she thought not of warmth, but of ration lines, and her mother's trembling hands slicing loaves too thin. These reactions came without warning, as natural as breathing. They reminded her that peace outside did not mean peace within. At first, she fought against it. She tried to force herself into forgetting, into pretending. She told herself that time heals all things, that she needed only to be patient. But months passed, then years, and still the scar pulsed inside her, tender as if fresh. She realized then that forgetting was not healing. Forgetting was erasure, and erasure dishonored everything she had lived through. This scar, stubborn and unyielding, demanded to be remembered, and so she learned to live with it. She stopped asking for it to fade. Instead, she listened to it. The scar spoke to her, not in words but in sensations, in the quickening of her pulse, in the tightening of her chest, in the heaviness that sometimes settled on her shoulders without reason. It reminded her that she had endured, that she had survived, that she carried within her the proof of life continued against every attempt to erase it. Others could not see it, and sometimes that isolation was its own pain. People expected her to smile, to celebrate, to move on. They did not understand that the war had not ended inside her. They saw only a woman who had survived. They did not see the weight survival carried. But those who had scars of their own recognized it. They looked into her eyes, and she into theirs, and without words they knew. The scar that refused to fade was their common language, their silent anthem. There were nights when she sat alone, tracing her own arms though nothing was marked there, whispering to herself, "I am still here, I am still whole, even with what cannot be erased." She began to understand that perhaps the scar was not an enemy. Perhaps it was a companion. It was the thread that tied her past to her present, the reminder that what she had endured had meaning. Without it, she might forget. With it, she remembered not only pain, but resilience. She told her grandchildren once when they asked about the war, There are wounds that close, and there are wounds that stay open. The open ones are the ones that teach you who you are. They looked at her, puzzled, too young to understand, but she hoped the words would stay with them, seeds waiting for their own moments of truth. The scar that refused to fade became part of her identity. It was there when she sang lullabies, her voice trembling yet steady. It was there when she stretched bread into miracles, when she told stories by the fire, when she held her brother's children and whispered blessings over them. It was there in her silence and in her laughter, in her dreams and in her waking. It never left, and in time she no longer wished it would. For she understood at last. Some scars are not meant to vanish. They are meant to be carried like flags, reminders of both pain and perseverance. Her scar was not a mark of weakness. It was a monument carved invisibly, declaring that she had endured what could have destroyed her. It refused to fade because her story refused to fade. And so she carried it, not as a burden, but as a truth. In the end, she realized the scar was not hers alone. It belonged to everyone who had survived alongside her, everyone who had lost, everyone who had endured. It was a shared wound, written across countless lives, carried in countless ways. The generals forgot her name, history forgot her story, but the scar that refused to fade ensured she would never forget herself. And that, she understood, was the deepest form of victory. She carried the war in her hands and still sowed futures. Her hands told more stories than her voice ever could. They were not delicate, not smooth, not untouched by life. They were cracked, calloused, worn down by water and work, by fire and frost. They carried the war in every line, every wrinkle, every tremor. When she lifted them to her face, she could smell smoke that never truly left her skin, feel the memory of rope and thread, hear the echoes of pots being scraped clean to feed too many mouths with too little food. Her hands were her history. They had been her weapons, her shields, her tools, her prayers, and though the war had marked them forever, they had not stopped creating. She remembered the endless days when her fingers stitched torn clothes until the light gave out. Shirts ripped by labor, blankets shredded by time, shoes worn thin by too many miles. All of them found a second life under her hands. Sometimes she patched with thread, sometimes with scraps of cloth, sometimes with nothing but stubbornness. Each stitch was a refusal to surrender. Each thread was a bridge stretched between despair and survival. Others saw mending as small work, domestic work, invisible work. She saw it as resistance. To sew was to say, "We will not fall apart, even when the world does." Her hands also knew the rhythm of carrying water, of chopping wood, of pulling weeds from soil that barely yielded enough to keep them alive. They blistered, bled, healed, and blistered again. And in every act of labor she carried the war. She carried its weight in buckets that sloshed against her sides, in baskets of firewood pressed into her back, in the ache that made her fingers stiff each morning. But she carried because not carrying was not an option, yet her hands were not only hands of survival, they were hands of creation. They sowed futures as surely as they mended the present. When she held her brother's small fingers and taught him to write his name, she was stitching his place in a world that wanted to erase him. When she braided her sister's hair, she was weaving a thread of normalcy into days that had none. When she baked bread, when she planted seeds, when she lifted a child into her lap and soothed them with a touch, she was sowing futures. Futures fragile, futures uncertain, but futures nonetheless. There was a night she remembered vividly, when exhaustion nearly broke her. Her hands shook too much to thread a needle. Her palms were raw from scrubbing floors. She wanted to let the fabric fall, to surrender to the dark, to allow the ruin around her to swallow her whole. But then she looked at the small faces watching her, waiting for warmth, waiting for comfort, waiting for proof that life continued. She forced her trembling hands to move again. And when she saw the blanket take shape beneath her, patchwork though it was, she understood she was not simply repairing cloth, she was repairing faith. Years after the war ended, when others forgot the hunger and the cold, her hands remembered. They still reached for scraps, as if nothing could be wasted. They still twitched at sudden noises, as if ready to stitch something torn. They still trembled at night, feeling the ghost of buckets carried, bread kneaded, wounds tended, but they also continued to sew futures. She sewed dresses for her daughters, mended uniforms for her sons, embroidered small flowers onto handkerchiefs as gifts. Each act, no matter how ordinary, carried within it the memory of extraordinary survival. She sometimes stared at her palms, at the calluses that never fully faded, and wondered, how many lives have these hands carried? How many stories lie hidden beneath their skin? She thought of Marta humming while stitching, of Sophia rocking her children while darning socks, of countless other women whose hands told the same story. They too carried the war, and they too sewed futures the world might never acknowledge. The generals had their monuments, the soldiers had their medals, but she and the women like her had their hands, and in those hands lived the quiet, enduring triumph of survival. Without them, no future would have existed at all. One day, long after the guns had gone silent, her granddaughter asked her why her hands looked so tired. She smiled and placed those worn hands over the child's small, unblemished ones. "Because these hands carried the war," she said softly, "and because they carried you." The girl did not fully understand, but she held the answer in her heart. And years later, when she stitched her own child's torn coat, she remembered. Her hands would never be free of the war. They bore it permanently, invisibly, but they also bore something greater, the proof that futures could be sewn from scraps, that hope could be patched together from ruins, that life could be held together even when everything tried to tear it apart. And so she lived with hands that trembled, hands that hurt, hands that scarred. She lived with hands that carried, stitched, created, healed. She lived with hands that refused to stop even when she wanted to, because hands, she learned, do not forget. They carry memory deeper than the heart, deeper than the mind. Her scars were in her skin, yes, but the truest scars were in her hands, and those scars were not signs of defeat. They were the flag she carried quietly, invisibly, proudly. She had carried the war in her hands, and still, despite it all, she had sown futures when her silence was louder than the anthem. The day the war ended, they called for music. Brass instruments blared in the town square, drums echoed against cracked walls, voices rose together in the anthem that once seemed forgotten. Men in uniforms shouted, leaders raised their hands, children waved flags stitched too quickly from whatever fabric could be found. It was meant to be joy, meant to be unity, meant to be proof that the nation had survived. And yet, as the anthem rang in her ears, she could not bring herself to sing. Her lips moved, but no sound left her throat, because inside her chest there was another anthem, one the world refused to hear. The anthem of silence. It was not silence born of apathy, it was silence born of memory. She remembered the nights when silence had been demanded of her, when a single whisper might have betrayed her family's hiding place. She remembered the silence of waiting for letters that never came, the silence after footsteps faded, the silence of hunger at the table. She remembered how silence had once been her shield and her prison, and she remembered how it had carved itself into her bones until she could no longer imagine life without it. Now, in the middle of a crowd shouting with joy, her silence roared louder than any anthem. She looked at the faces around her, flushed with triumph, with relief, with pride, and she wondered how many of them truly remembered. How many of them had lived in silence the way she had. How many of them carried scars that could not be sung away? Her brother tugged her sleeve, asking why she wasn't singing. She smiled faintly and squeezed his hand. "Because my song is different," she whispered. He frowned, confused, but did not press her. Children, she thought, should not have to understand everything. Some truths were too heavy to be given too early. Her silence was not empty. It was filled with voices the anthem ignored. Marta, who hummed over cloth until her breath gave out. Sophia, who whispered prayers while her children slept hungry. Her mother, whose trembling hands kneaded dough in the dark. All the women who had no medals, no monuments, no recognition. Their anthem had been silence, endured day after day, stronger than any trumpet or drum. That was the anthem she heard in her heart as the crowd shouted around her. Later, when the parades ended and the streets grew quiet again, she sat by her window and listened to the silence. For the first time, it did not feel like suffocation. It felt like truth. In silence, she could hear the memories others tried to bury beneath noise. In silence, she could honor the ones who had not returned, the ones whose voices had been stolen forever. In silence, she could still carry the war without allowing it to be erased by celebration. She realized then that silence could be louder than any anthem because it held honesty. Songs of victory tried to close chapters, to declare endings. Silence admitted that the war had never truly ended inside them. Silence acknowledged that scars still pulsed, that grief still lived, that survival was not the same as triumph. Silence respected the depth of what had been lost, and so she chose to keep her silence as an act of remembrance. When others sang, she listened. When others cheered, she stood still. Not because she lacked gratitude for peace, but because she understood that peace demanded memory. To sing without remembering would have been betrayal. Her silence was her promise, that she would not let memory vanish beneath the noise of celebration. Years later, when her grandchildren asked her why she never sang the anthem, she answered softly, "Because silence was the only song we were allowed during the war, and I promised never to forget it." They looked at her with wide eyes, trying to grasp the weight of such words. She smiled and stroked their hair, wishing they would never have to understand completely. Her silence became a flag of its own, invisible yet powerful. Wherever she went, it followed her, not as absence but as presence. People sometimes mistook it for sadness, for distance, but those who looked deeper saw strength in it. They saw that her silence spoke more than words could. It said, "I survived. I remember. I refuse to let forgetting erase what was endured." When she closed her eyes at night, she sometimes dreamed of standing among ruins, hearing both songs and silence. In those dreams, the silence always outlasted the music, because music ends when the song is over, but silence endures, carrying echoes forever. And so, even as the world rebuilt itself, he built. Even as laughter returned to streets and voices filled the air again, she carried her silence with her, not as burden, but as truth. For she knew that when the songs of generals faded, when the anthems of nations shifted, silence would still hold the memory of those who had no voice. Her silence was louder than the anthem, and she carried it, not with shame, but with pride. For in that silence lived all the voices the world had tried to forget, and as long as she held it, they would never be erased. Her scars became maps for the next generation. She used to hide her scars, at first because she thought they were shameful, later because she thought no one would understand them. They were not the dramatic wounds of soldiers, not marks to be honored in parades. They were small, almost invisible to the untrained eye. Calluses on her hands, shadows in her gaze, tremors in her breath whenever silence grew too heavy. But as years passed, she began to notice something she had not expected. Her scars, though invisible to many, became visible to those who followed her. They were not just reminders of pain. They were maps. Her children, and later her grandchildren, looked at her with questions she sometimes struggled to answer. Why did she save every scrap of fabric? Why did she keep bread crusts in a jar, long after hunger was no longer at their table? Why did she go silent when thunder rolled or footsteps echoed too sharply? She thought at first she owed them explanations, long stories filled with details, but slowly she realized that the scars themselves were lessons. Without words, they guided the next generation. Her grandchildren learned thrift, not from speeches, but from watching her stretch leftovers into meals. They learned resilience not from books, but from seeing her stand steady when others panicked. They learned compassion not from lectures, but from the way her eyes softened whenever she saw another person suffering. Her scars shaped her actions, and her actions shaped their lives. The scars had become maps, charting paths for them, even when she remained silent. One day, her granddaughter asked her why her hands looked so worn, as if time itself had written upon them. She smiled, placed those hands over the girls, and said, "These are the marks of work and survival. Follow them, and you will know how to endure." The girl traced the lines gently, as though they were rivers flowing into unknown lands. And in that moment, she understood the next generation would not need to carry the same wounds, but they would need the maps of those who had survived. She began to see her scars not as something to hide, but as gifts. Each tremor, each memory, each ache was a signpost pointing forward. Her silence taught patience, her carefulness with food taught gratitude, her instinct to comfort others taught compassion. Even her flinches at sudden noises taught vigilance, a reminder that peace should never be taken for granted. The scars she carried in her heart became lessons in resilience. She told the children, "Pain does not vanish, but it changes shape. You must learn from it, not bury it. What you inherit from me is not my suffering, but my survival." They listened, wide-eyed, trying to grasp the weight of words shaped by decades. She thought often of the women who had not survived, the ones whose maps ended in silence. Marta, Sophia, her own mother, all of them had carried scars too, scars that could have guided others if only they had lived long enough to pass them on. She spoke their names often, not only to remember, but to stitch their maps into the future. She told her grandchildren of Marta's songs, of Sophia's prayers, of her mother's trembling hands that still baked bread. In doing so, she turned their scars into guidance as well. Sometimes she wondered if this was the truest purpose of survival, not simply to live, but to pass on maps drawn in scars, to make sure the next generation did not walk blindly into the same darkness. To remind them that even when the world collapses, there are ways through. Scars, she realized, were not just marks of the past. They were compasses for the future. When her grandchildren grew older, they began to carry small fragments of her ways into their own lives. One became a teacher, patient with every child, remembering her stories of silence and endurance. Another became a nurse, steady in the face of suffering, recalling the way she had held others through tears. Another planted gardens in poor soil, refusing to believe that the ground was too barren, remembering the way she had coaxed life from rubble. Each of them carried her scars not on their skin, but in their choices. And in those choices, the scars lived on as maps. She found comfort in that. It meant her scars were not wasted, not meaningless. They had guided her forward, and now they guided others. They had refused to fade, not because they were cruel, but because they were necessary. They were the ink with which she had written her story, and through her descendants, that ink would not run dry. One evening, as she sat with her family gathered around her, she realized that she no longer felt ashamed of her scars. She no longer wished them gone. She touched her hands, her chest, her face, and whispered silently, "You have become maps, and maps, once given, cannot be erased." The next generation did not need to suffer the way she had. That was the point of maps. They were guides, not prisons. They were not meant to drag others into the same darkness, but to show them the paths out of it. She understood then that this was her legacy, not medals, not monuments, but scars that had transformed into maps, guiding those who came after her into lives where hope could be chosen, where peace could be protected, where resilience could be honored. And so, in her quiet way, she became a cartographer, of survival. Her body, her memory, her silence, all of it charted roads through ruins, rivers of tears, mountains of fear. And though the generals had forgotten her name, the next generation would not forget her maps. When her scars became the flag, she carried. She had carried her scars quietly for years, almost as if they were secrets. At first, she thought they made her less, marks of weakness, signs of survival that no one cared to honor. Later, she saw them as burdens, proof that she could never fully leave the war behind. But time, patient and insistent, reshaped her understanding. With every season that passed, with every grandchild who sat at her feet, with every moment of silence she carried proudly, she began to realize something she had never dared to imagine. Her scars were not just hers. They had become symbols, larger than her body, larger than her life. They were a flag, not the kind of flag raised in triumph by generals, not a cloth of bright colors waved above ruins in victory. Her flag was invisible, stitched from pain and persistence, woven from silence and song, dyed in the rivers of her own tears. And though no one saluted it in the town square, though no anthem was written in its honor, she carried it everywhere she went. It was hers, and it was stronger than any fabric raised on a pole. She thought back to the first scar she had ever known, the silence of waiting for her father, the kitchen that smelled of bread and gunpowder, the letters that never arrived, the night silence pressed too heavy, the invisible battles written into her skin, the flags women wove from ashes, the children she raised beside ruins, the songs that survived the trenches, the tears that became rivers, the day the generals forgot her name, the scar that refused to fade, the hands that carried war and sowed futures, the silence louder than an anthem, the scars that became maps for the next generation. Each chapter of her life had been a thread, each scar a stitch, until at last she saw what had been forming all along, a flag not of victory, not of conquest, but of endurance. It was a flag of survival, of women who endured without recognition, of children who laughed beside ruins, of neighbors who shared crumbs of bread in the dark, of songs that outlived bombs, of tears that refused to dry, of scars that refused to vanish. She carried it not for herself alone, but for all of them, for Marta, for Sophia, for her mother, for the nameless women whose stories would never be written. Sometimes, when she sat alone at dusk, she would close her eyes and feel it. Not cloth, not thread, but something heavier, holier. Her scars raised together, forming a banner inside her chest. She imagined unfurling it above the ruins of memory, not to claim territory, but to honor what had been endured. It was a flag that whispered instead of shouted, that carried silence instead of songs, that held grief and resilience in equal measure. Her grandchildren once asked her why she always touched her hands before telling stories, as though she were gathering strength from them. She told them, "Because my scars are here, and my scars are my proof." They nodded, not fully understanding, but they listened carefully. She hoped that one day, when they carried their own scars, they would remember that scars are not shame. Scars are survival. Scars are flags. She never expected the world to recognize her flag. She knew history belonged to the loud, to the powerful, to the men who wore medals. But she also knew that the quiet, invisible flags women carried were the ones that truly kept the world alive. Without them, nations would have collapsed, not just in body, but in soul. Without them, there would have been no future to inherit. So she carried her flag humbly, invisibly, but proudly. She carried it when she sang lullabies to children born after the war. She carried it when she planted gardens in soil that had once known only fire. She carried it when she sat by windows and allowed silence to rest beside her without fear. She carried it in her stories, in her hands, in her gaze. And when she grew old, when her hair turned white and her back bent under years of labor and memory, she understood at last what her life had meant. She was not forgotten. Her name might not be written in books, But her flag lived on in her children, in her grandchildren, in the way they lived, the way they loved, the way they carried compassion and resilience forward. Her scars had become their inheritance, their guidance, their strength. Her scars had become their map, their shield, their flag. One evening, as the sun set and painted the sky with colors of fire and ash, she whispered to herself, "This is what it means to live beyond war, to carry scars not as chains, but as banners, to lift them high, even if no one sees, even if no one salutes, because they are proof. Proof that we endured, proof that we loved, proof that we are still here." And so, at the end of her long journey, she stood in silence. Not the silence of fear, but the silence of truth, and let the flag she carried unfurl one last time within her. It was not cloth, it was not thread, it was scars, invisible yet undeniable. Scars that spoke louder than any anthem, scars that endured longer than any monument, scars that belonged not only to her, but to everyone who had survived. When her eyes closed for the last time, she did not imagine battlefields or generals or flags waving in squares. She imagined her own flag, woven from silent song, tears, scars, rising quietly into the evening sky. And she knew then, with certainty, that it would never fall, because scars, once carried with love and memory, are eternal, and hers had become the flag she carried for the world.